The YouTube channel Unpacked is one of the best Jewish YouTube channels out there. And on their channel, they have a video that talks about the beginnings of the Jesus movement and how it morphed into Christianity. And this video has over 250,000 views. We're going to take a look at a clip of this video and give you our Chosen People Answers reaction. Let's roll the clip.
It wasn't until Paul came along that the early Christian doctrine went from being somewhat at odds with Judaism to contradicting what the religion stands for altogether. After Jesus' crucifixion, his apostles continued to preach his message with his brother James at the head of the Christian congregation. The story goes that when a Pharisee named Saul was struck blind with a prophetic vision of Jesus, everything changed. After this vision, Saul, renaming himself Paul, brought a whole new dimension to the narrative. The story of Jesus went from that of a revolutionary man to an embodiment of God himself, very different from Judaism. Paul decided circumcision wasn't necessary and the laws of Moses no longer applied. He even began converting non-Jews. This rubbed James and other leaders, like Peter, the wrong way, and they summoned Paul to the Jerusalem Council. But eventually, the early Christian church embraced Paul's approach of appealing to non-Jews, and at that point, Christianity became its own distinct religion. Paul's shift to a new target demographic was also accompanied by a large redesign. The Hebrew prayers were changed to the common tongue of Greek. Paul believed that the covenant of Moses had been fulfilled with Jesus' sacrifice, and a new covenant was forged. The new perspective was that the single act of Adam and Eve's original sin in the Garden of Eden condemned all of humanity, so the single act of Jesus' sacrifice would be the rectification for all of humanity. As said in Romans 5:18, therefore, just as one man's trespass led to condemnation for all, so one man's act of righteousness leads to justification and life for all. The practitioners didn't need to do the 613 commandments that Judaism held so sacred. A follower simply needed to believe in Jesus, and they would be granted eternal salvation. The 5 books of Moses, regarded as the fundamental revelation of Judaism, was relabeled as the Old Testament, while the writings of the Apostles, the Epistles of Paul, the Book of Revelation, and a few other writings would comprise a New Testament. With the new religion rooted in Judaism, but now combined with a doctrine that welcomed assimilation into the society at large, conversion for Hellenized Jews sounded extraordinarily appealing.
Okay, guys, what do you think about this video? How about we start with stuff that we actually agree with? Because there's a lot of problems in there. What do we actually agree with to start off?
I agree that justification does come through one man, and that is Yeshua Messiah, Romans 5:18. I like how they quoted that.
Yeah, it's a good quotation of the New Testament up there on the screen. Yeah, that is the gospel right there.
I mean, I agree that Paul had a Damascus Road experience. You know, we have, I would differ a little bit the portrayal, but yeah, he had a Damascus Road experience.
And she called him a Pharisee, which is a nice touch. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Paul definitely went to the Gentiles. He went to the nations to share a message with them.
So they got some things right there. But now let's talk about some of the problem points that we see with this video. Jonathan, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. So like immediately I hear the Christian congregation, right? That she's portraying Paul or James. James is part of a Christian congregation. I really think this is like anachronistic because James, or more accurately Yaakov, he was the head of the Jerusalem community of Jewish followers of Yeshua who continued to practice Judaism. They weren't anything like what we would call today Christian. So I just portraying it in the way that's not even in the text, I think, is, I would say, unintentionally misleading.
Yeah, and related to that, in terms of anachronism, like retrojecting a modern notion of what Judaism is onto the first century, is I think they said that Paul contradicted Judaism, as if there's this one monolithic idea of what Judaism is or should be in the first century. That definitely was not the case. A lot of different groups were debating about what the Bible teaches or what it doesn't teach. We know that there was Pharisees who believed in the resurrection of the dead, Sadducees who didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. There's the Sadducees who were in control of the temple and thought the temple was functioning well because it's under their control. Then there's the Essenes who thought that the temple is corrupt, and so they went and isolated themselves to the desert. Judaism was very non-monolithic. It was very heterogeneous at the time. So to situate Paul against Judaism as if there's this one thing to contradict is anachronistic as well.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that one of the biggest mistakes that was made in the video is that the presenter mixed together Paul's message to the Gentiles with his message to his fellow Jews. And she treated it as if, when Paul said that Gentiles don't need to circumcise their sons, that he said the same thing to his fellow Jewish people. And we learn in Acts chapter 21 that that was not the case. And so she's kind of playing with this term Christian and being loose with it and saying that anybody who believes in Jesus, whether you're Jewish or Gentile, you just take on this Christian identity and you all practice and believe the same thing. Now, belief might be the same between Jews and Gentiles who believe in Jesus as the Messiah, but practice, that's completely different. We see in the New Testament that Paul and the other apostles, they continued their Jewish practices. They continued keeping the Torah to the best of their ability. And so when she says that Paul said that the Torah has been fulfilled and you don't need to keep it, and makes it so easy for assimilation, well, that's not for the Jewish people that he was preaching to. And everybody would agree, whether you believe in Jesus or not, that Gentiles don't need to keep the Torah. So where is this anti-Jewish teaching? Where's this accusation coming from? Of course, Gentiles don't need to keep the Torah, and that's exactly what Paul was telling his listeners who were from a Gentile background.
Yeah, definitely. It's like on one hand, Paul telling Gentiles they don't need to be circumcised is very much following the Torah, because Gentiles don't need to be circumcised according to the Torah. Now, she could, to bolster up her case a little bit, there are some texts in Paul that even Christians have stumbled across, and they read as Paul being anti-circumcision. Like in Galatians 6, Paul says neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything. It's like, okay, wow, he's saying circumcision is meaningless. He says something similar in 1 Corinthians 7. But the important thing to remember there is he's just saying, relative to the importance of knowing Messiah, it doesn't matter whether you're Jewish or Gentile. What matters is knowing him and placing your trust in him. So he's not saying that circumcision is meaningless in every way. In fact, in Romans 3, verse 1 and 2, he says circumcision is advantageous much in every way. And so I think he's actually speaking in a way very similar to the prophets. The prophet Hosea in chapter 6 says, or it's God speaking in Hosea, and God says, I desire goodness, not sacrifice. That sounds pretty stark, sounds pretty harsh, but in reality, it's just God saying that goodness is more important than the sacrifice. So he still wants the sacrifice in Hosea, but he more so wants goodness, like relative to each other. Goodness is what matters most. So in Messiah is what matters most, whether Jew or Gentile.
And I think a lot of biblical scholars would say that the people that Paul was writing to in the book of Galatians, they were Gentile background. And so, of course, if they think that as Gentiles they need to be circumcised, then that is actually going against not only Judaism, but also the teachings of Jesus and the Jewish apostles. And that doesn't apply to, say, if you have a Jewish mother like Timothy, Paul goes ahead and he circumcises Timothy. And that's in accordance with the book of Galatians, because Galatians is speaking predominantly to Gentiles who think they need to be circumcised.
And I also think that the only way that the presenter could record this video and make it compelling is if you totally ignore Acts 21, like you mentioned, Brian. Like the question is asked and answered whether Paul is teaching Jews living among the nations in the diaspora to not circumcise their sons, whether that's true. And Paul disproves this rumor by taking a Nazirite vow and having other men with him take that Nazirite vow. So he's proving through his own actions that he actually does teach Jewish people to circumcise their sons. Circumcision had a lot of value for him. And yeah, in New Testament scholarship, we see that scholars are recognizing that Paul is writing primarily to Gentiles in his letters. But even in a text like Romans, where he's writing to Gentiles, he says in Romans 3, verse 1 through 2, then what advantage has the Jew, or what is the value of circumcision? Much in every way. The Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God. So when I watched the video, I saw her say, that circumcision no longer mattered for Paul. But Paul, right there, even in a letter directed towards Gentiles, he's telling them something about advantage of being a Jew. Paul is a Jew himself. Read Philippians 3 in the book of Acts. He's saying that circumcision definitely has much value.
Now let's talk about what she said about assimilation and this accusation that, you know, there's this pure, pristine Judaism that is all in Hebrew, that resists assimilation, stays away from any kind of outside ideas. And then comes Paul, and now he opens up the gates not only to the Gentiles, but also to all kinds of assimilation with foreign cultures. He translates the prayers from Hebrew into Greek, and so now everybody's saying it in Greek. These are a lot of accusations here. Where do we begin in responding to this?
Well, it kind of stays in line with what we were just talking about on going to again to 1 Corinthians 7. Paul is very much against assimilation in either direction. He doesn't want Jews to become Gentiles, and he doesn't want Gentiles to become Jews. In 1 Corinthians 7, Paul says, if at the time of your call you were circumcised, remain Jewish. If at the time of your call you were uncircumcised, if you're a Gentile, then remain Gentile. So Paul is actually very much encouraging, and he's saying, this is my rule in all the congregations. He's even giving it as a instruction, as a very significant instruction, to remain as you are, to not assimilate in either direction, whether you're Gentile or Jewish, but to have your identity firmly in Messiah, Yeshua.
And I think there's also an assumption in the video that Greek is Christian, is Gentile, and not Jewish. And I think that just shows, if that is the intention there, that just shows a lack of knowledge of the literature in the first century, in the Second Temple period, because you see there's Jewish writers like Josephus, who we know much about the first century. That's our historical source. He's writing in Greek. You see, there's a lot, the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Tanakh, which Jewish people had available to them in the first century when Jesus lived, that is Greek. So there are the letter of Aristeas, there's lots of different texts, the Psalms of Solomon, of Jewish texts that are Philo, that are written in Greek. And we would, if we eliminate those sources from our Jewish history, we would really be lacking in our knowledge. We wouldn't really know about the story of Hanukkah, right, from the books of Maccabees and Josephus. Though the historical record before the Talmud, it was written in Greek.
And I even remember there's a passage in the Talmud that talks about Greek being a beautiful language, and it's the only language that you are allowed to translate the Hebrew prayers into. You are allowed to say the Shema in Greek. So whether or not these early Jewish and Gentile followers of Jesus were praying in Hebrew or Greek, it's kind of beside the point, because everybody was using Greek at that time, and it's kind of a hollow accusation.
Yeah, and similar to what you were saying, Brian, at least my familiarity with some of what the Talmud says in regards to reciting the Shema is actually, it is a prayer that one should do in a language that they understand. So if one actually does not understand the Hebrew, they actually halakhically should do it in the language that they understand. So if at that time it was Greek, they had to say it in Greek, halakhically speaking. And then I think we even have some Greek words creep up into the Mishnah. I believe afikomen, our favorite dessert during Passover, is
how about
Greek,
synagogue?
or at least Greek in origin.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's right. Synagogue is another one.
There's so many words. There's so much Greek influence on Judaism during this time period. I mean, where do you get the idea of having traveling sages, traveling rabbis who have a bunch of disciples who are following them and listening to them? You don't get that anywhere in the Tanakh, but that was common in Greek culture and Hellenistic culture. Now, are you going to say that rabbis having disciples is totally outlawed because it came from Greek culture? No, I'm not saying that, because Yeshua himself was a rabbi who had disciples. But just by labeling something Greek, that doesn't make it bad, evil, false, or dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
And while we're talking about this idea of translation, I want to make sure we don't miss another claim that she made in the video, which is that Saul changed his name
Ah,
to Paul.
yes. That's
So
so common. I hear it from the pulpit, from pastors. I hear it in Jewish contexts. It is so common to say that. So why is it that that is such a problem?
So, on one hand, it's such a problem because it's a mischaracterization of the text. On the other hand, and sadly, how it's often been used from a church pulpit is it's taken as this great symbolic moment where Saul the Jew converted and became Paul the Christian, and he shed all of his Jewishness as he became a follower of Christ. So it perpetuates this false narrative of Paul and his life, who he continued to identify as a Pharisee and as a Jew all throughout his life. And as we talked about in Acts 21, he publicly proclaimed everybody and showed everybody that he continued to follow Torah throughout his life. So it's a way that perpetuates a false narrative about who Paul was. Now, as often as I've heard it at churches, on YouTube, I actually don't think I've ever heard anybody say that Saul changed his own name to Paul.
Yeah, that was a new
I don't know.
twist.
Have you guys ever heard that? Like
No,
I've heard people say like God changed his name to Paul or something like that. But I think she's really on her own by saying that Saul changed his own name to Paul. But the text itself really puts this notion to bed. In Acts 13:9, it's very simple. It says Saul, who was also called Paul. So he
Also,
had also called Paul. So in the very sentence where Paul is introduced for the first time as one of Saul's names, he's still primarily referred to as Saul. Saul, who is also called Paul.
and
And
this is really relevant
just
to today as well because I'm a Gentile. I have one name. Okay, Gentiles we maybe have my middle name, so I have two names. Okay, but my first name I only have one version of that. It's Brian. Jonathan, how many names do you have?
Yonatan ben Aharon. So,
Okay, and do you
yeah,
say that
and that's my
name
Hebrew
to
name.
everybody?
No, no. Only if
No.
I'm called to do an aliyah.
Yeah. So when you're
Or read
talking
from
to
the
a
Torah.
Gentile like me, what do you call yourself?
I'm Jonathan.
Okay, now that is the
Yeah,
same name in English
yeah.
and in Hebrew, so maybe you could say you have one name, but still, you're giving one in Hebrew and the other in common English. Eric, how many
hmm
names do you as a good Jewish boy have?
I was given two first names, Eric and Asher.
Wow. So, what we're talking about here is still happening in Jewish culture today. You keep a Hebrew name and the vernacular name of wherever you live, and Paul did the same thing 2,000 years ago.
Yep.
Yep.
And even before him, so at least at the time of us recording this, we just celebrated Purim, and we heard the Megillah being read. And in Esther, in the story of Esther in chapter 2, verse 7, it says that Mordecai has a cousin named Hadassah, who is also known as Esther. So even in the Tanakh, we see the same thing happening. So I just really didn't want to miss touching on that point because it's one that really is not shown in the text at all and is very a silly notion to make and perpetuate a false picture of who Paul was.
And Paul's, of course, in the New Testament, he's not the only one to have two names. Matthew is also called Levi. There's other examples in Colossians 4. There's a guy named Jesus, also called Justus. There's different names we find throughout the New Testament, and even in the Tanakh, as you mentioned, Eric, that people having more than one name.
And this is a good way that people have brought up to deal with some of the difficulties in the New Testament accounts. So, like, for instance, some of the Gospels name the 12 disciples in one way, and another Gospel names the 12 disciples in a different way. And what's the best way to resolve that? It's to say, well, one of the accounts is giving a Greek name and the other is given a Hebrew name. I mean, it's not difficult once you actually learn the Jewish traditions, background, culture that had multiple names in play for the same person.
Another point I have to mention. You mentioned, Brian, about like this idea of saying we're bringing in more pagan practices and ideas within the Jesus movement that she sees incorporated to find basically Jews who are Hellenized or Gentiles who are pagans, and they would be attracted to this religion. And one idea is she's saying Jesus became an embodiment of God himself, and how that was foreign to Judaism. And that really stuck out to me, because when I read when I listen to her, how she's saying it went from Jesus being just a man to being the embodiment of God. Read the four Gospels, and especially the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You see that throughout, in very Jewish ways, Jesus claims to be the embodiment of God himself. And even scholars today, like Jewish scholars like Daniel Boyarin and others, recognize this to be the case. So I can get into it, but in very Jewish ways, Jesus is claiming to be that embodiment of God.
Yeah, I think that this presenter is taking a very common theological notion that is prevalent in Jewish thought today, that a man cannot be God, that God cannot become a man, and then placing that back into the realm of Second Temple Judaism. And I think that that is fundamentally anachronistic. That's really taking, say, a Maimonidean concept that God cannot be associated with any body, any physicality, and saying that's exactly what Jewish people believed in the first century. And yeah, you're right, Jonathan, to say that a lot of Jewish scholars today, Daniel Boyarin, you mentioned, Benjamin Sommer, Shaul Magid, there are many others who say that actually when you look at the first century Jewish accounts, they actually had a much more fluid understanding of how God interacts with the world, and that he actually can have a positive interaction with his physical creation, even being in physical bodies. And I think we're going to have a lot of episodes about this very subject in the future. But just suffice to say, from my perspective, that, yeah, she's really being anachronistic here and saying that this was not allowed in Judaism in the first century.
Yeah, and a lot of those scholars that you guys mentioned, they'll appeal to very foundational Jewish texts like Genesis 18, for example. So they're not even all just trying to follow like whether it's permissible logically. They even found it in Jewish scriptures itself as possible, at least, interpretations found in the Torah itself.
But one thing good that I do agree with is that she's saying Paul teaches the embodiment of God. And that is true. That is true. It's just also true that Yeshua also taught this about himself. And his earliest followers, Jewish followers, believed this and taught this as well.
Okay, any other talking points to disagree with?
So near the end, I don't quite remember her exact phrasing, but it seemed as if she was saying, like, oh, you just need to believe in Jesus.
Oh, yeah.
And you don't need to do any of the 613 that we all hold so sacred. Mm-hmm. And I mean, in one sense, I can affirm that. It's like, yeah, we are saved by grace through faith in Messiah Yeshua. And if you believe in your heart that God raised from the dead, and then you will be saved. But on the other hand, if what she's saying like is, oh, all you need to do is have this like intellectual belief that Jesus is the Messiah, and then you can go ahead and do whatever you want. You can sin all you want because you're saved by grace. Well, that is not what the New Testament teaches. That's not what historical Christianity teaches. It's saying much more than just having an intellectual belief that Jesus is the Messiah, but it's actually placing your trust in him as the Messiah and surrendering your entire life to follow God. And that very much involves following God's instructions and living a holy life. So in Ephesians 2, when Paul famously says that by grace you have been saved through faith and it's not by good deeds, the next very verse he says, but we are created in Messiah Yeshua for good deeds. So it's from our trust in Messiah Yeshua that our good deeds sprout forth. And that expectation, I think at least, is actually very similar to what we see in the story of Israel, where salvation comes to the Jewish people before we did anything that deserved it. God took us out of Egypt. He saved us from slavery in Egypt, and then he gave us the Torah as a way for us to respond to that salvation in obedience. So I actually view that as very similar to how even the Torah operates.
Right, and nobody says that, okay, now Israel has been saved from Egypt, so now she can do whatever she wants.
Yeah.
You can't read the Torah or the entire Tanakh. You can't come away with it with that understanding. So why would you say the same thing about the New Testament, where it says you have been saved by grace through faith? You're saved in a spiritual way, similar to the way that Israel was saved physically from Egypt. Now you're saved spiritually, so now you can live however you want. That's not how the New Testament reads.
Yeah, you could even go straight to Paul's own words on this matter when he says, should we go on sinning so grace may abound? Absolutely not. Like, he addresses it directly in the very book of Romans that we brought up earlier. This word for faith can also, pistis, can also be translated as faithfulness. And faithfulness involves not just, as Eric, you mentioned, just intellectual assent, but just living a life devoted to the one you are putting your faith in, who you're following, being Yeshua. And that call of life, that way of life, involves being obedient to God's instruction.
Yeah, I really wish I could remember which commentary or which Jewish scholar I was reading, but I remember reading a scholar contrasting emunah to faith in the Christian sense. And he says, well, faith is just belief. Emunah is trust and faithfulness and loyalty. And I read that, I was like, oh, it sounds to me like emunah and faith are the same thing then. Because faith is trust and loyalty and faithfulness.
And there's also this sense, so I brought up earlier how she says that there's this infusion of really ideas that were foreign to Judaism that Paul brought. And original sin is one of them and others, and she could just list whatever Paul teaches and say that's not Jewish. But this is not keeping in mind that Paul himself is Jewish, who has Jewish ethics, but not just, we don't need to necessarily find parallels in Paul's teaching with other Jewish literature. We can do that, absolutely. But just because Paul is unique doesn't make him not Jewish, like any other teacher around the first century. I mean, there was Rabbi Hillel and Shammai. At one point, they may have said something for the first time at one point in history, but them saying it uniquely doesn't make them not Jewish.
So there's been a lot that we have had to say in response to this Unpacked video, and while they get some parts right, there's a lot of misconceptions and a lot of ways that I think that we can do better as both Christians, myself, and as Jewish people to understand where we're coming from. And as Messianic Jews, you guys, Jonathan and Eric, people oftentimes don't understand where you are coming from as well. So although I believe that this video is trying to do a good job in understanding the world of the New Testament and the beginnings of the Jesus movement, it really is important for us to go back to the first century, to look at Second Temple Judaism, and to really place ourselves in the shoes of those first Jewish people who believed in Jesus as the Messiah, and be careful that we do not bring in anachronisms like the future church, future Gentile Christians, and mixing everything together so that all the details are lost. And so for those of you who are listening to Unpacked and their take on Christianity and on early Messianic Judaism, we encourage you to look a little deeper. So thanks for being with us today, and we look forward to having you with us next time. Shalom.